Hello class. This week we're talking about secondary data. So it's after you have read, I think it's chapter 10 within your textbook. So this week we're talking about how to analyze secondary data, comparative methods, content analysis, crime mapping, big data, methodological issues when you use secondary data, and ethical issues when you use secondary data. So what is secondary data analysis? Many of you in your discussion this week did very well with explaining this. But in secondary data analysis is the collection or analysis of data that was collected originally by someone else. And you can find numerous places that you can collect data. And so there's four major types, which are surveys, official statistics, FBI, UCR, NIBRs, official records, historical documents, all of that. When you aren't collecting the data yourself, sending out your own surveys, doing an experimental research, talking with someone in person, then you can use secondary data analysis. What are the advantages of using secondary data analysis? First of all, I think I was telling some students this week, it saves time and money. The data is already there. You don't have to spend the time collecting it. You don't have to create your measurement tool. You don't have to create a survey and questions. It's also it allows the researcher to avoid data collection problems. So you're not having all of the sampling error that we talked about earlier. It also allows analysis of social processes in other inaccessible settings. In other words, data that's already been collected, it would be difficult to get arrest data from doing a survey. This way you're getting a more accurate data. Oops. Let's get rid of that big picture. Some more advantages. So depending on the specific data set in your topic, you may be able to facilitate comparison with other samples. It may allow inclusion of many more variables than you were able to actually identify, and allows data from multiple studies to be combined. It also allows for longitudinal analysis, especially using data that's already been collected over time. It saves, again, saving time and money on the researcher. So what are the sources, as I was just mentioning? The most common sources are the social science survey data that's collected in studies and funded by federal and state governments. You can go to doj.gov. You can go to fbi.gov. There's official records that are maintained by government agencies and that are used for administrative purposes rather than research, but you can take that data and use it for your research purposes. There are a few sources of qualitative data that are available for secondary analysis, but the number is growing. So it's always easier to use if you're using a quantitative design. Comparative methods. This is research that's comparing data from more than one time period and or more than one nation. So there's two types of comparative methods, the descriptive and the analytic. Our descriptive is research that seeks to understand the structure, nature, or scope of the nation's or nations' criminal justice systems or rates of crime. If you're evaluating, let's say, trafficking in the United States and trafficking in Sweden, you would do a descriptive comparative research. The analytic is research that seeks to understand how national systems work and the factors related to their operation. I think someone is doing, I'm not sure if it's this class or the thesis, but they're doing an analysis of dictators and their use of torture. So when they're looking at that, they're trying to understand how that national system works. So they would be using an analytical comparative research design. This comparative methods usually examines phenomenon across societies. It could study several countries. You could be studying several social groups within one country. So it's across cultures and nations. So in many of these studies, study how cultures and nations deal with crime. that transcends their borders, and then you compare it to other nations. This also is a focus on the research questions that are more general in nature. Content analysis, another type of our secondary data. It's the systematic, objective, quantitative analysis of message characteristics. And if you'll notice, this is actually not in APA. You would have to have a comma here, and then you have a comma here, page, period 1. Unless it's a paragraph, and then it's PARA, period 1. A content analysis is a survey designed with fixed choice responses. So it's not open-ended. So it's fixed choice so that it produces quantitative data that can be analyzed statistically. Anytime you are using an open-ended question, it's very difficult to quantify that because you're going to have multiple answers. You might have a different answer from everyone that you surveyed if you have open-ended questions. Content analysis, it bears some similarities to qualitative data analysis because it involves coding and categorizing text, discovering relationships among constructs identified in the text, and statistical analysis of those findings. If you have qualitative data, as I talked about last week, a couple weeks ago, that in order to quantify it, you have to code it. So, and I think I mentioned this in some of the discussions, that whenever you have responses, you always want to have like yes and no. That's qualitative, but you quantitate it by putting a 1 or a 2 in front of those. And that way you can enter that within your statistical software and analyze all the ones that said yes. Content analysis is also similar to secondary data analysis because it involves taking the data and text that already exists and subjecting them to a new form of analysis. But unlike secondary analysis, content analysis also involves sampling and measurement of primary data. So you're doing a little bit of both. How do you identify a population of documents? The units that can be surveyed are numerous. So you might find a multitude of the sources that you're looking for. Analysis proceeds through several stages. You want to identify a population of documents. The documents and what's in the data is your population. You want to determine the unit of analysis. Are you looking at individual data, group data? Are you looking at more abstract data? You want to select a sample of units from the population. For instance, within my own data, I've looked at juveniles, and what I did for my thesis, I looked at offenders that were incarcerated. So my sample was incarcerated offenders, and then I could separate that into male and female. Design coding procedures for the variables to be measured, test and refine the coding procedures, and base a statistical analysis on counting occurrences of a particular item. Crime mapping. This is also included within our discussion this week. Be aware of this because you will see this again. It's data that's used to identify the spatial distribution of crime along with social indicators that are similarly distributed across areas. And you see there's all types of formatting that you can use for crime mapping. And I think within your textbook, it's currently used by a majority of urban law enforcement agencies to identify crime hotspots. So you actually see they might have a geographic map, and they may have pinpoints all throughout the mapping showing, especially if they're, say they're investigating serial murders, and they see that the same type of crime has been happening. Hopefully they wouldn't have a lot of pinpoints, but it could be with a robbery. They're saying that it's happening in this one area. Well, why is it happening in this one area? This is what they use to evaluate and to solve the crime. Risk terrain modeling. This predicts the probability of crime occurring in the future using the underlying factors of the environment that are associated with legal behavior. So you're using the factors within your environment. What is big data? This is very large data sets, and it contains thousands of cases that are accessible in computer readable form. This is the type of data that I used in my thesis because I used a data set from the ICPSR so I was comparing the actual offender data from those that are incarcerated in the state and federal correctional institutes. Well, the data set was so large that it's actually only collected, it was collected about every 5 years. Now they've gone to, it's been almost 15 years since they've been able to collect this data, just because of the time consuming and the amount of data with which they have to code. This big data sets are used to reveal patterns, trends, and associations between variables. Just like I said, what I did with mine, I was evaluating numerous variables like the types of crime, their environment, their family, their history, their recidivism rates. Could be the type of programs they've been involved with within the prisons. But there I could reveal the patterns and trends across, so that those that I evaluated, let's say those that are from a single parent home, were they more involved in a certain type of crime. Special methodological challenges within content analysis, and that documents and other evidence may have been lost or damaged, and I think somebody mentioned this in their discussion. This could happen. Also, existing evidence may represent a biased sample. So, like for instance, newsworthy figures are those who are more prone to writing. So when you're seeing that content analysis, you're only getting what was collected. And the feelings of individuals involved in past events may be hard, if not impossible, to reconstruct. Remember what I've said this in some of your writings, that we never report what somebody feels, because there's no way for us to judge that as an individual, and especially as a researcher. So we can report what someone reported they felt. So there's a difference within your wording. You don't want to say, ABC believed that crime would happen tomorrow. It would be ABC reported they believed. It's all in your types of wording. Also, some more challenges. You might have a small number of cases. Your variable cross-national recording keeping practices, the meaning of concepts and the operational definition of variables may change over time and between nations. And remember, this is part of your conceptualization, your operationalization, that you report all this. So, but they could change over time. And remember, a definition, what we think in America may not be the same definition that someone would have in Europe. And so you have to be very careful when you're comparing data sets from different areas. Responsible use of secondary data requires some really good understanding of the primary data source. You need to understand where it's coming from. So what were the agency's goals in collecting the data? Why did they collect it? You'll see some data sets. In fact, I was going to use one for a research project I did, but it was so old and no one else had done it before. So it was, I had done it since. And so that was one of my intrigues to it, that I thought if I can collect it just how they did, it would be quite a study. Also, who was responsible for the data collection? What were their qualifications? And this is very important. When you use secondary data within your study, you need to report that. You need to report who collected it, and all this is listed, especially if you go to the ICPSR with the University of Michigan, that you can actually, it'll state down there who collected it and their qualifications. You need to report when and what data was collected, and what were they intending to measure. Did they measure what they meant to do? What methods were used for data collection? All of this is reported within your study if you use secondary data. How is the information organized? Are there identifiers that are used to identify the different types of data available on the same case? All of this is going to be listed within the code book and the description of the data set. How consistent are the data with the data available from other sources? If you're picking something from one data set and it's completely different from maybe what you've read in literature, maybe looking at just other data online, or even seeing data from a court or a jurisdiction, if it's some completely different, that may be a red flag. What is known about the success of the data collection effort? How is missing data indicated? What kind of documentation is available? These are all the questions that you need to ask yourself when you're looking over secondary data. And you would also include this within your study. What are the ethical issues in secondary data analysis? Many of you approach this within your discussion because when you look at using secondary data for your own study, you need to think about what are the issues of actually using that data. So generally, confidentiality is not an issue because existing data from research studies is usually in public use files. It's already done, it's already been collected, they've already ensured confidentiality. Many of those that are collecting their own data or did collect their own data had to go through the IRB, so there was a supervision there to the confidentiality. Also, confidentiality could be an issue in historical records and official agency records. If this is data that's being collected by an official agency, there was no consent and there was no confidentiality ensured. Identifiers should have been removed and files have been created so that any researcher can access it without violating confidentiality. We talked about this, and one student actually included this within his design, that if you do collect your own data, when you report it in your study, you remove any identifiers. You might take, you would have their names so that you ensure and you can show that to anyone that questions your research. But you would then use an identifier, a number, a string of numbers and letters, however you want to identify it, so that when you put it in your published article or you put it within your study, there's no way to connect that information to any individual. And the Freedom of Information Act stipulates that all persons have a right to access all federal agency records unless those records are specifically exempted. So any agency record that's out there, you have a right to get to that, unless, like I said, it is exempted. And some other issues when we're talking about secondary data, that the IRB determines whether review is necessary. Even when you're using secondary data, you can submit an expedited review to your IRB. And if you're working on your thesis, this is what you would do if you're using secondary data. You submit it to the IRB at LNU, and they will determine if there needs to be anything else completed. Ethical concerns are increased when the surveys are conducted or other data are collected in other countries. Are they collected the same way? Are they supervised with a similar IRB board? If the researcher lacks much knowledge of the norms within the locality or the values in the routine activities, the potential for inadvertently harming subjects could occur. And that, did they take any confidentiality when they collected the data? When you don't know how it's collected in other countries and their process, you could be harming someone inadvertently. Yeah, I think that's it. Any questions, please let me know. Send me any emails, and I'll see y'all next week.